The dogs were working well. That's what the handler said afterward, in her report, in her interview with the search coordinator, and in the follow-up statement she gave investigators 3 weeks into the case. She said it repeatedly because she wanted it on record. She wanted everyone who reviewed the file to understand that clearly. The dogs were working well. The scent was strong. Both animals were engaged, pulling forward, confident. This was not a marginal trail, not the kind of degraded scent that handlers sometimes have to coax and encourage dogs through. This was active, fresh-seeming work on a clear September morning. The conditions were good. 54 degrees, calm air, low humidity. Ideal conditions for scent tracking. They had followed the trail for 2.5 miles from the base camp where Keith Alderman had last been seen. 2.5 miles of clean, unambiguous tracking. And then both dogs stopped, not slowed down, not showed confusion, not lost interest and circled back to pick up a diverging trail. They stopped. At a point in open timber on dry ground, with no water feature nearby, no road crossing, no terrain boundary that would explain a scent disruption. Both dogs stopped simultaneously and showed clear signals of having reached an end point. The handler tried to reset, brought the dogs back down the trail, gave them fresh scent material, and started again. Both dogs tracked back to the same point, the same endpoint, the same open piece of forest. She tried a second dog team brought in from a different facility. The second team tracked from the base camp. Same endpoint. 3 dogs, 2 independent teams, working a scent trail that had been clear and strong for 2.5 miles. All 3 stopped in the same place. The handler's written report contained one line that the case file coordinators later flagged as worth examining. She wrote, "In my assessment, this does not represent a loss of trail. This represents an end of trail. Loss of trail means the scent degraded, scattered, was disrupted by environment. End of trail means the scent is no longer present because the person is no longer present." She was saying she believed Keith Alderman, at some point at or near that location, had stopped producing scent. What that means, what would cause a living person walking through a forest to stop producing a scent trail at a specific point on dry ground in calm air, is the question that has occupied investigators, the family, and everyone who has studied this case. No one has answered it satisfactorily. Keith Alderman was 57 years old. He had been hiking and camping in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State since his early 20s. He was not a technical climber, not a mountaineer, but he was a committed and experienced backcountry traveler with decades of wilderness time across the Pacific Northwest. He was a high school biology teacher. He knew the outdoors with the same systematic attention he brought to teaching. Not casual familiarity, but studied, practiced knowledge. His students had taken field trips into the mountains with him. Parents trusted him to bring their children back safely. He was, by every account, someone who understood wilderness risk and managed it carefully. He had planned a solo 4-day trip into a wilderness area in the North Cascades. Not a technical destination, but a serious backcountry route through terrain he had traveled twice before. His wife, Carol, dropped him at the trailhead on the morning of September 4th. She had done this many times over their 28 years of marriage. She watched him adjust his pack, confirm his permit, and walk toward the trail. He told her he'd be back Thursday. Thursday came, Keith did not. Carol waited until 2 in the afternoon, then called the Okanogan County Sheriff's Office. Search and rescue teams were on the trail by evening. The dogs arrived the following morning. Keith's planned route was documented in the trip permit he had filed, and in notes he had left on the kitchen table at home, a habit he maintained so that Carol would always know where he was if something happened. He intended to hike to a high lake on the first day, camp there, then continue north to a secondary basin on day 2. Day 3 was a rest day at the basin. Day 4 was the return. The search started at the trailhead and worked north along his planned route. There was evidence of Keith at the first lake. A search team found the remnants of a campfire at a site Keith had used on a prior trip, the same location Carol identified from photographs as his preferred camp spot at that lake. The fire ring had been used recently. A boot print in soft ground near the water's edge was consistent with Keith's boot size. He had made it to the first lake. The search then moved toward the northern basin, the Day 2 destination. The terrain between the first lake and the northern basin required crossing a ridgeline. The crossing was on a maintained trail. The trail was well-defined and used regularly by hikers. The dogs tracked Keith's scent along the trail toward the ridge crossing, and at a specific point approximately a quarter-mile below the ridgeline, in open timber on the maintained trail, the scent ended. Not at the ridge, not at a water feature, not at any boundary, in open timber, on a clear trail, 2.5 miles from the base camp that had been established near the first lake. The endpoint was on flat, accessible, unremarkable terrain. The handler described the location in her report as, and I'm quoting directly, a section of trail with no environmental feature that would account for scent disruption. She had seen dogs lose trails at stream crossings, at rocky sections where scent disperses, at points where a subject has crossed a road, and vehicle exhaust has masked scent. She had never seen a trail end cleanly in a section of open timber on a well-maintained trail in calm conditions. This was her 20th year of search and rescue work. The search expanded over the following days. The ridgeline crossing was checked extensively. Teams covered the maintained trail over the ridge and worked the northern basin. They found no sign of Keith in the basin. Teams worked south of the endpoint, back toward the first lake, to ensure they hadn't missed anything in the initial pass. They found nothing south of the endpoint either. Nothing beyond the boot print at the first lake and the remnants of the campfire. On day 4, the aerial search began. A helicopter flew systematic grid patterns over the primary search area. Thermal imaging was used during 2 overnight flights. Nothing. On day 5, a search team working an off-trail section east of the main trail, working the drainage below the ridgeline in terrain away from Keith's planned route, found something. A water bottle. Blue, standard trail water bottle, approximately 1 liter. Sitting upright at the base of a tree, about 30 yards east of the maintained trail. 30 yards off the trail, in the drainage below the ridgeline. The water bottle was not damaged. It still contained water. It appeared to have been set down rather than dropped or thrown. Investigators compared the bottle against Carol's description of Keith's gear. She confirmed the color and style matched what Keith typically used. The bottle's location was approximately a quarter-mile south of where the scent endpoint had been established. Not at the endpoint. South of it. If Keith had been at the endpoint going north and then somehow moved east into the drainage, he would have crossed the section of terrain where the scent ended. Or the water bottle had been at that location before Keith reached the endpoint, placed there at some earlier time during the hike. Whether the water bottle was a clue or a distraction, investigators couldn't determine. Its location, 30 yards off the trail in the drainage, upright, with water in it, was logged and preserved. And it raised the first question about whether the endpoint was actually an endpoint at all, or a point at which Keith had moved off trail into terrain the dogs hadn't worked. The dogs had been worked along the maintained trail. They had tracked the scent along the trail to the endpoint. They had not been worked extensively in the off-trail terrain east of the trail, the drainage where the water bottle was found. This was a procedural decision made by the handlers on the first day of dog work, based on the expectation that Keith was following his stated route on the maintained trail. The dogs had been deployed along the route he had said he would take. When the water bottle turned up in the eastern drainage, investigators had to consider whether the dogs should have been worked off-trail from the beginning, or whether, if they had been, the trail might have continued east from the end point. The handlers returned to the end point with the dogs and worked them into the eastern drainage. The dogs did not pick up a continuing trail. They did not show interest in the direction of the water bottle. They remained at the end point. This created a contradiction the investigation never fully resolved. The water bottle was in the eastern drainage. The dogs found no scent in the eastern drainage. Either the water bottle wasn't Keith's, or Keith had been in that location at a time early enough that the scent had degraded before the dogs arrived. Or something else. The search coordinator's report noted both possibilities and could not close either one. Now let's talk about the witnesses, because the North Cascades in September are not empty. There are other hikers on those trails, particularly in the early part of the month when the season is still viable, and investigators collected statements from every hiker who had been in the area during the relevant period. 3 accounts were specific enough to warrant attention. The first came from a couple named James and Patricia Solt, who had been hiking the same trail system on September 5th, the day after Keith entered the wilderness and the first full day of his trip. They had been heading south on the trail toward the first lake when they passed a man heading north. The man was alone, carrying a full pack. He nodded at them. No conversation. They described him as around 55, medium build, wearing a green rain jacket. When shown a photograph of Keith, both said they believed the man was him. James was confident. Patricia said she thought so but was less certain. If this identification was correct, Keith had been on the trail heading north at some point on September 5th. The location where they had passed him was approximately 1.5 miles north of the first lake, roughly 1 mile south of where the dogs would later stop, alive and moving north, on the trail, 1 mile from the end point. The second witness account was harder to place in the timeline. A solo hiker named Andrew Park had been in the area over September 5th and 6th. He had camped at a site approximately 2 miles north of the end point, past the ridge line in the northern basin. He told investigators he had seen a man in the basin area on the afternoon of September 5th. The man was moving south toward the ridge line from the northern basin. If that was Keith, he had passed through the northern basin, crossed the ridge line south, and was heading back toward the first lake area by the afternoon of September 5th, 2 days before he was due out. That would put him a full day ahead of his stated schedule and moving in the wrong direction. When investigators showed Andrew a photograph of Keith, he said he thought it could be the same man, but he wasn't certain. The distance had been significant, and the light was difficult at that time of afternoon. He could not confirm or deny it, but if Andrew's sighting was accurate, and if the man was Keith, then Keith had reversed direction a day early, leaving the northern basin and heading south before he was supposed to. Something had changed his plan. The third account was the most specific and the most troubling. A hiker named Donna Reyes was on the trail on September 5th, heading north. She was approximately 3/4 of a mile south of the endpoint, working her way up toward the ridgeline, when she saw a man sitting beside the trail, not hiking, not resting while standing, sitting on the ground beside the trail with his pack beside him. She said he appeared to be looking at something. She wasn't sure what. He wasn't looking at a map. He wasn't looking at a phone. He seemed to be looking at the ground in front of him, or at something in the trees. She almost spoke to him, but didn't. She described her decision not to as a gut instinct. Something about the way he was sitting seemed intensely private, like she was intruding on a moment. She kept walking. She described the man as around 55, medium build. She did not see his face clearly. She could not identify or rule out Keith from the photograph, but the location she described was south of the endpoint, not at it. A man sitting on the ground beside the trail, apparently still, 3/4 of a mile from where the dogs would later stop. If that was Keith, he had been sitting beside the trail between 11:30 and noon on September 5th. 3 hours later, the dogs would not be able to follow his trail past the endpoint, 3/4 of a mile north. What was he looking at? What was he sitting beside the trail to see? Donna Reyes doesn't know. She didn't look back. But investigators asked her to describe the location where she had seen the man sitting, as precisely as she could. They walked the trail with her a week after the search began and asked her to identify the spot. She identified a section of trail where the timber on the east side thinned, creating a partial opening in the forest. The opening looked east, into the upper section of the same drainage where the water bottle would later be found. From that specific point on the trail, a person sitting beside it would have a partial view into the drainage below. Not a spectacular view, not a scenic overlook, just a place where the trees opened enough to see some distance into the terrain east of the trail. If Keith had been sitting there, looking east, he had been looking into the drainage where his water bottle was found, the drainage where the cold case reviewer believed he might have gone. The investigators who walked the trail with Donna noted this. They noted the view east. They noted the location relative to the water bottle discovery site. They could not determine whether Keith had been looking at anything specific, or whether the man Donna had seen was Keith at all. But the location was marked, 3/4 of a mile south of the endpoint, looking east, into the drainage. And Keith Alderman has not been found to explain. Let's go back to the endpoint. Because investigators did not simply note it and move on. They examined it thoroughly. And what they found, or more precisely, what they didn't find, generated a specific set of questions. The endpoint was on the maintained trail in a section of open Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir. The terrain was flat at that point, no elevation change within 50 yards in any direction that would account for scent behavior. The ground was dry, September in the north. Cascades can be wet, but the preceding days had been clear and mild. The trail surface at the endpoint was packed earth with some rock, the kind of surface that holds scent reasonably well under normal conditions. There was no evidence of a water crossing. The nearest water feature was a small drainage approximately 100 yards to the east, the same drainage where the water bottle would later be found. That drainage wasn't large enough to typically disrupt scent in the way a river crossing would, and it was 100 yards from the endpoint, not at it. There was no evidence of a vehicle or road crossing. The nearest road was miles away. There was no evidence of significant foot traffic that would have contaminated or overwhelmed Keith's scent. The trail was used, but not heavily used, and the dogs had worked through sections of higher traffic without losing the trail. The endpoint was, by every assessment, a piece of ordinary, unremarkable trail. The handler said as much. The search coordinator said as much. The cold case investigator who reviewed the file 2 years later said as much. Ordinary trail. End of scent. 3 teams of trained dogs. Same result. But investigators didn't stop at the visual assessment. On day 5, they brought in a scent specialist, a researcher affiliated with a university program that studied search dog behavior and scent dynamics in wilderness environments. He was not a handler. He was a scientist who studied the conditions under which canine scent detection produced anomalous results. He spent a day at the endpoint with instruments. He measured ground temperature, air movement at surface level, humidity gradients between the trail and the adjacent timber. He took soil samples for later laboratory analysis. He also interviewed both handlers at length. His written assessment, submitted to the search coordinator a week later, concluded that there was no environmental explanation he could identify for the scent endpoint at that location. He noted that the conditions at the time of the tracking were close to ideal for maintaining a scent trail. He noted that the ground surface held scent well under those conditions. He wrote, "The cessation of detectable scent at this location, given the documented conditions, is not consistent with natural scent degradation or environmental disruption. My assessment is that this endpoint represents an unusual and, with available knowledge, unexplained outcome. An unusual and unexplained outcome." That phrase appears in the case file. It appears in the cold case review. It has appeared in every summary of this investigation since the first week of the search. Nobody has been able to move past it. 3 teams of trained dogs. Same result. 2 additional details from the endpoint area were logged in the case file and noted specifically in the cold case review. The first, a search team working the endpoint area closely on day 3 found a section of disturbed soil approximately 15 feet east of the trail edge. Not a boot print, but an area of roughly 2 square feet where the topsoil had been scraped or disturbed, as if by a boot sliding or rotating. 1 area of disturbed soil. Not a print. Not identifiable as belonging to Keith, but in a location that was consistent with a person stepping off the east side of the trail at the endpoint. If Keith had stepped off the trail to the east at that point, into the drainage, it might explain why the dogs, working the trail, couldn't continue. The scent would have left the trail and gone into the drainage. But the dogs had been worked into the eastern drainage after the water bottle was found. They hadn't picked up a trail there. There was a gap of 3 days between the initial dog work and the subsequent drainage search. 3 days. September weather. A scent trail, if it existed, might not have survived. The second detail, a survey of the endpoint area found a piece of reflective orange flagging tape in the branches of a tree approximately 10 feet east of the trail, at the edge of the area where the soil disturbance was found. Flagging tape is common in wilderness areas. It's used by trail crews to mark work areas, by hunters to mark routes, by biologists to tag sample points. Its presence in a forest is not inherently significant. But Keith was a biology teacher. He used flagging tape professionally. He had flagging tape in his pack. Carol confirmed this. It was something he always carried. The tape in the tree could have been placed by anyone. It could have been there for months. It was approximately 4 feet off the ground, at a height consistent with someone reaching up to place it. The cold case reviewer noted both the soil disturbance and the flagging tape. He noted the possible connection to the eastern drainage. He could not close the connection with the available evidence. He wrote, "The end point, the soil disturbance, and the flagging tape in combination suggest the possibility that the subject moved off-trail to the east at this location. The subsequent failure of dog teams to track east of the endpoint is not conclusive evidence against this interpretation, given the time elapsed between initial tracking and the eastern drainage search. A possible move east, a 3-day gap that may have erased the evidence of it, and a missing biology teacher who always carried flagging tape. Let's talk about what investigators called the missing timeline. Keith entered the wilderness on September 4th. He was due out September 8th. Search and rescue activated on September 8th, when he didn't appear at the trailhead. The dogs worked the trail on September 8th and 9th. What happened between September 4th and September 8th? The evidence gives us a partial map. September 4th, Keith enters the wilderness, confirmed by trailhead permit log and by Carol watching him walk to the trail. September 4th, sometime in the afternoon or evening, Keith reaches the first lake and makes camp. Evidence: boot print near the water, used fire ring at his known camp location. September 5th, sometime in the morning, James and Patricia Soult pass a man heading north, approximately 1.5 miles from the first lake. Likely identification as Keith. September 5th, late morning, approximately 11:30 a.m. Donna Reyes sees a man sitting beside the trail 3/4 of a mile south of the endpoint, looking east into the drainage. September 5th, afternoon. Andrew Park, in the northern basin, sees a man moving south toward the ridgeline. Uncertain identification as Keith. And then there is nothing until the dogs picked up the trail on September 8th, starting from the first lake camp and running north to the endpoint. 3 days in which the witness accounts give us glimpses of Keith on September 5th, and then silence. Where was Keith on September 6th and 7th? If Andrew Park's sighting was accurate, Keith had reversed direction by September 5th afternoon and was heading south again. He could have been back at the first lake by September 5th evening. But Keith was not due out until September 8th. His plan had him at the northern basin on days 2 and 3. If he had already turned back on day 2, what did he do on days 2 and 3? Did he return to the first lake and wait? Did he explore the eastern drainage? Did he go somewhere else entirely? The investigation has no answer for those days. The witnesses provide a partial picture of September 5th. Nothing gives investigators any account of September 6th and 7th. 2 days of complete absence from any evidence record. For a man who was careful, who carried a trip plan, who always told his wife where he was going. 2 days that have produced not a single piece of recoverable evidence. The endpoint, when the dogs found it, was the end of the trail in every sense. But the trail had 3 days of history that investigators could not reconstruct. Let's examine every theory the investigation formally considered. The first, Keith became disoriented and went off trail somewhere south of the endpoint. This would be consistent with Donna Reyes's account of a man sitting beside the trail in apparent stillness, someone who had already begun to lose navigational certainty. If Keith had been experiencing early disorientation, at 11:30 a.m. on September 5th, he might have continued north briefly before leaving the trail. But experienced outdoors people with 30-plus years in the mountains don't become severely disoriented in familiar terrain under clear conditions without a precipitating cause. Keith had been in that terrain before. He was on a maintained trail. Disorientation is possible. It doesn't fully explain the clean endpoint. The second, a medical event incapacitated Keith at or near the endpoint. A cardiac event, a stroke, a seizure. Something sudden that took him down before he could signal. His last medical records showed no predisposing cardiovascular concerns. He was active, in good physical condition for his age. But sudden cardiac events don't require predisposing factors. They happen. If Keith had collapsed at the endpoint, the search should have found him in the vicinity. The endpoint area was carefully searched. Keith was not there. A medical event that incapacitates and kills leaves a person where they fell. Unless they had time to move after the event began, which is possible with some cardiac events and with strokes, they don't end up miles away. Keith has not been found anywhere near the endpoint or anywhere else in the search terrain. The third, Keith moved east off the trail and was not found because the eastern drainage search was delayed. This is the theory the physical evidence most tentatively supports. The soil disturbance, the flagging tape, the water bottle in the drainage. If Keith went east, and the 3-day delay meant the dogs couldn't track him there, then the eastern drainage and terrain beyond it might not have been adequately covered. The eastern drainage runs toward lower terrain. If Keith continued east and descended, he would have eventually reached the Methau Valley drainage system, accessible terrain well below the wilderness boundary. Searches did not extend to that terrain. The probability model kept resources concentrated in the primary search area. If Keith made it to lower terrain east of the wilderness boundary, the search may never have looked in the right place. This is the theory that the cold case reviewer considered most worth investigating further. He recommended additional dog work in the eastern drainage with fresh handlers and, if possible, aerial survey of the lower Methau terrain. Neither of those recommendations had been fully implemented as of the most recent review of the file. The fourth, foul play. The North Cascades in September are not uninhabited. Other hikers, hunters, and recreation users are in the area. A chance encounter that turned dangerous was not outside the range of possibility. Investigators examined Keith's personal life. No significant conflicts, no financial disputes, nothing that would suggest a targeted act. The witnesses on the trail described a man moving normally and without apparent stress. Donna Reyes's account was the closest to anything unusual. A man sitting beside the trail in stillness. But that's not consistent with an ongoing threatening encounter. There was no physical evidence of violence at the endpoint or anywhere in the searched area. Foul play could not be confirmed. It could not be eliminated. It was assessed as possible, but not supported by available evidence. The comparative cases in this category, cases where trained search dogs lost a trail at an unexpected location, are documented with enough frequency that researchers and handlers have discussed the phenomenon in professional circles. The first case worth examining is that of Dennis Martin, a 6-year-old boy who disappeared in the Great Smoky Mountains of Tennessee in June of 1969. Martin's case is one of the most studied in missing persons research, and one of its most examined features is what happened when tracking dogs were deployed. The dogs tracked Dennis's trail from the campsite where he had last been seen. The trail was clear for approximately 100 yards. Then the dogs stopped and showed signs of distress. Not a gradual loss of trail, but an apparent reluctance to continue in the direction the trail went. The handlers noted it as unusual. Dennis Martin was never found. The comparison to Keith Alderman's case is imperfect. Different circumstances, different era, different terrain. But the specific feature of dogs showing unusual behavior at a scent endpoint is a documented similarity. The second case is more recent and more directly comparable. In October of 2017, a hiker named Paul Becker, 53, disappeared from a trail system in the Wallowa Mountains of northeastern Oregon. Paul was experienced, fit, and had hiked those specific mountains many times. Search dogs tracked his scent along the main trail for approximately 2 miles. The trail ended on dry ground, no water feature, no road crossing. Sound familiar? The handler in Paul Becker's case wrote a report that used language that, when placed next to the report from Keith Alderman's case, reads as if written by the same person about the same incident. No environmental explanation for the endpoint. Conditions were appropriate for continued tracking. Both animals showed consistent endpoint behavior simultaneously. 2 different handlers, 2 different states, 2 different years, 2 different missing persons, the same language, the same finding, the same unexplained stop. Paul Becker was found 9 days later, alive, approximately 6 miles from where the dogs had stopped. He had been in a drainage below the western ridge, terrain that was outside the primary search area, terrain the dogs had not been directed toward. He had no coherent explanation for how he had gotten there. His memory of the period of his disappearance was fragmented in the way that Walter Crisp's had been. Specific gaps, not general haziness. The connection between where the dogs stopped and where Paul was found was never reconstructed satisfactorily. There was terrain between those 2 points that should have held scent and should have been trackable. The dogs had not found it. Paul Becker recovered fully. He remains unable to explain his own movements during those 9 days. His case and Keith Alderman's share the same central anomaly, a scent trail that ended cleanly at a specific point with no environmental explanation for the endpoint. In Paul Becker's case, the person survived and was found. In Keith Alderman's case, neither has happened. The third case is documented in David Paulides' research on wilderness disappearances and involves a hunter in Northern California who disappeared from a wilderness area in the Sierra Nevada in 2003. The search dogs tracked his scent for over a mile before stopping at a point that handlers described in terms almost identical to Carol Brecht's assessment of Keith Alderman's endpoint. The hunter was never found. Paulides has documented more than a dozen cases in his research where search dogs stopped at an unexpected location without environmental explanation. He notes the consistency of the feature, the same type of endpoint, the same handler confusion, the same failure of subsequent investigation to explain the stop. He does not explain it. He documents it. The pattern is specific enough to be worth noting without overclaiming what it means. Carol Alderman gave one interview after Keith's disappearance was made public. She was careful and precise in what she said. She was asked about the dogs. She said she had spoken to the lead handler, the woman who had written the report about the endpoint. She said she had asked the handler directly to explain in plain language what she thought had happened. The handler had paused before answering. Then she said, "I know what the scent told me. I know where it started, and I know where it stopped. What I don't know is what happened in between those two things. And in 20 years of this work, that is the question I have never been able to answer about this case." Carol said she had found that answer both honest and terrible. Honest, because the handler wasn't pretending to have an explanation she didn't have. Terrible, because if a trained professional with 2 decades of experience couldn't explain what happened to the scent trail, couldn't explain why 3 dogs stopped at the same point in open forest, then the thing that had happened to Keith was something outside the range of what those 20 years of experience had prepared her for. Carol said, "Keith knew those mountains. He was careful. He was experienced. He had done everything right. And somewhere between the first lake and that ridge, something happened that none of the people looking for him could explain." She paused. The dogs knew something had happened. I believed that. Whatever they were telling us when they stopped, that was real information. We just didn't know how to read it. Keith Alderman's case file has been reviewed twice since the initial investigation. Both reviews identified the same outstanding questions. What caused the scent to end at the endpoint in open timber on a maintained trail? Did Keith move east off the trail into the drainage? And if so, where did he go from there? What is the connection, if any, between the water bottle in the eastern drainage, the soil disturbance at the trail edge, and the flagging tape in the tree? Who was the man sitting beside the trail that Donna Reyes saw? And was it Keith? If Andrew Park's sighting in the northern basin was accurate, and if the man was Keith, what caused him to turn around and head south a day early? And where is Keith Alderman? The second review recommended expanded aerial survey of the eastern drainage below the wilderness boundary, and renewed ground search of the terrain between the endpoint and the lower Methau Valley drainage, with particular attention to the areas that the original probability model had not prioritized. As of the most recent public update from Okanagan County Search and Rescue, those recommendations have not been fully implemented. The case remains open. The eastern drainage is still unsearched at the density that the evidence arguably warrants, and Keith Alderman remains missing. The dogs stopped in open timber on a maintained trail on the morning of September 8th, 3 days after Keith had entered the wilderness. 3 teams of trained tracking dogs, 2.5 miles of clean, confident tracking, and then a point in the forest where all 3 stopped and could not continue. The handler said it. This wasn't a loss of trail. This was an end of trail. The distinction matters. Loss of trail means the environment disrupted the scent, water, wind, road traffic, time. These are understood phenomena. Handlers encounter them regularly. They know how to work around them. End of trail means the scent is no longer present because the person is no longer present. That's what the handler believed the dogs were telling her. The person was no longer present at that location. But there is no evidence Keith was removed from that location. No evidence of a vehicle. No evidence of another person. No evidence of a struggle. No evidence that anything at all happened at that specific piece of open, unremarkable, flat, dry trail in the North Cascades. Just a point in the forest. Just trees and ground, and a maintained trail that continues north toward a ridgeline, and dogs that stopped there and couldn't say why. If the eastern drainage theory is correct, if Keith moved off the trail to the east, placed a piece of flagging tape at the tree, and entered the drainage for a reason no one has been able to establish, then the endpoint was a turning point. A place where Keith left the trail. And the dogs, trained to follow the trail, could only follow it to where it ended. But the eastern drainage has been searched. The dogs were worked there. 3 days after the initial tracking. They found nothing. Maybe 3 days was too long. Maybe the terrain between the endpoint and wherever Keith ended up has never been searched at the right density, in the right direction, with the right approach. Maybe the answer is in the ground east of that trail, and no one has walked exactly the right section of it. Or maybe the endpoint is exactly what the handler said it was, an end. And the question of why is one that 5 years of investigation, 3 dog teams, 2 case reviews, and everyone who has studied this file has not been able to answer. Why did the dog stop? Why does a trail that was clear and strong and confident for 2.5 miles end at a specific point in open forest, with no environmental explanation? What happened to Keith Alderman at that location on that trail? The dogs knew something. We still don't know what they knew. The endpoint is still there. The trail still runs north toward the ridgeline. The eastern drainage is still there, unsearched at full density, 3 days of scent degradation behind us, and years of weather and seasons since then. And Keith Alderman's file is still open. If you were on that trail system in the North Cascades in the first 2 weeks of September, and you saw something, or heard something, or passed someone who has stayed in your memory, the Okanagan County Sheriff's Office is still accepting information. The family is still looking. The dogs stopped at a specific point in the forest and couldn't continue. What were they trying to tell us? That question is still waiting for an answer.